Part 1. The Restless Carpenter. The summer heat of 1964 hung thick over Ripon College's modest campus in Wisconsin, and Harrison Ford sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor of his dorm room, contemplating a future that felt as empty as the beer bottles scattered around him. At 22, he was 4 years into a philosophy major that had taught him how to question everything except what he actually wanted to do with his life. His hands, calloused from summer construction jobs, strong and steady, rested on his knees as he listened to his roommate prattle on about graduate school applications. Harrison had tried to care about Socrates and Kant, about epistemology and metaphysics, but the words felt like chalk dust in his mouth. He was a C student in a world that demanded excellence, a square peg being hammered toward a round hole of academic conformity. "You're not even listening, Ford," his roommate said, snapping him back to the present. "I was thinking about that stage production," Harrison replied, which was partly true. Just 3 weeks earlier, he'd signed up for a drama class on a whim, or perhaps out of desperation. It was worth $10 toward the campus radio station, and he needed money. But something unexpected had happened when he'd stepped onto that small stage in the college theater. For the first time in 4 years, he'd felt something. The class was taught by William Fusick, a man whose passion for theater burned with an intensity that seemed almost ridiculous in the sleepy Midwest campus. Fusick had cast Harrison in a small role, and when the young man delivered his lines, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence, something clicked into place. It wasn't the applause that mattered, sparse as it was. It was the sensation of becoming someone else, of inhabiting a different skin, a different story. His girlfriend Mary, later to become his first wife, Mary Marquardt, had been in the audience that night. She'd seen something too, though she couldn't quite articulate it. "You were different up there," she told him afterward, her hand finding his in the darkness outside the theater. "More alive." But alive didn't pay the bills. Alive didn't satisfy his father, Christopher Ford, a former actor himself who'd abandoned the stage for the steadier waters of advertising. Christopher had made his choice, trading dreams for stability, and he expected his son to follow a similar path, though preferably one with more prestige than selling Ivory soap and Camel cigarettes to post-war Americans. Harrison's mother, Dorothy, a former radio actress, understood the pull of performance, but she'd also learned its costs. She'd given it up for motherhood, for the comfortable ranch house in the Chicago suburb of Park Ridge, for car payments and PTA meetings. When Harrison called home to tell her he was thinking about dropping out to pursue acting, the silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Finish your degree first," she'd said finally, her voice carrying the weight of her own abandoned dreams. "Then you can do whatever you want." So he'd finished. Barely. He graduated in June 1964 with a degree in philosophy that he'd use exactly never, and a burning certainty that he needed to be anywhere but Wisconsin. Los Angeles called to him with the siren song it had sung to thousands of dreamers before him: sunshine, possibility, reinvention. Mary came with him. They married young, too young, some would say later, and headed west in a car packed with everything they owned. The journey across America's heartland in that summer of 1964 was a pilgrimage of sorts, each mile carrying them further from the sensible, expected life and closer to the great unknown. Los Angeles in the mid-1960s was a city transforming itself. The studio system that had dominated Hollywood for decades was crumbling. Television had changed everything, and the young filmmakers who would soon create the new Hollywood movement were just beginning to find their voices. But Harrison Ford knew none of this when he arrived. He knew only that he needed to act. The reality of Los Angeles hit hard and fast. The city sprawled endlessly, a concrete maze where dreams went to die as often as they came true. Harrison and Mary found a small apartment they could barely afford, and Harrison began making the rounds, auditions, cattle calls, anything he could find. He had no training beyond that single drama class in Ripon. No connections. No strategy. Just a stubborn determination that bordered on delusion and a face that casting directors found interesting but couldn't quite categorize. He wasn't leading man handsome in the classical Hollywood sense. His features were too irregular, his demeanor too gruff. But there was something there, something the camera liked even if the people behind it didn't yet understand what to do with it. His first role came through Columbia Pictures' New Talent program in 1966. It was a minor miracle, really. He'd been signed to a contract paying $150 per week, a fortune to the young couple who'd been living on Mary's waitressing income and Harrison's occasional carpentry jobs. The studio executives saw potential in this intense young man with the penetrating eyes and the working man's hands. They put him through classes, teaching him how to move, how to speak, how to be a star. It all felt manufactured, artificial, like being stuffed into a suit that had been tailored for someone else. But he endured it because this was the path, the way things were done. You learned the craft, you paid your dues, you waited for your break. His first credited role came that same year, 1966, in a film called Dead Heat on a Merry-Go-Round. Harrison played a bellhop. He had one line, exactly one, delivered to James Coburn's character. "Paging Mr. Jones, paging Mr. Jones." 14 words if you counted the repetition. Roughly 3 seconds of screen time in a 107-minute film. The studio executives watched the dailies and pronounced their verdict. "Kid, you ain't got it." Columbia dropped his contract. Just like that, the dream was over before it had really begun. Harrison was 24 years old, married, and had just been told by the professionals that he lacked the essential quality needed to succeed in the only thing he wanted to do. He could have gone home then. Could have called his father, admitted defeat, found a sensible job in Chicago doing something respectable and soul-crushing. Many did. Most did. Harrison Ford bought a hammer and a saw instead. The carpentry wasn't meant to be permanent. It was survival, a way to keep food on the table while he figured out what came next. But his hands, those strong, capable hands that couldn't quite gesture the way drama coaches wanted, were perfect for building things. He discovered he was good at it, maybe even talented. He could look at a space and envision its transformation, could turn raw lumber into bookcases, cabinets, door frames. More importantly, carpentry gave him something acting never had: control. When he built something, it stayed built. The quality of his work determined his success, not some casting director's whim or a studio executive's gut feeling. He took jobs around Los Angeles, building and renovating for people with money, producers, directors, writers. It was honest work, and it paid better than the studio contract had. Mary supported them both, but the carpentry money helped, and more than that, it gave Harrison back his dignity. The auditions didn't stop, though. He couldn't quite let it go, this acting thing. Every few weeks, he'd wash the sawdust off, put on clean clothes, and sit in another waiting room full of hopeful faces, reading for parts he rarely got. He appeared in a handful of television shows. The Virginian Ironside, Gunsmoke, playing cowboys and criminals, always in the background, always forgettable. In 1967, Universal Studios signed him to another contract, another chance. They put him in a film called A Time for Killing, then Journey to Shiloh, alongside James Caan. The roles were small, the films forgettable. The executives at Universal looked at his work and saw the same thing Columbia had seen: potential unfulfilled, talent unrealized. "You'll never make it in this business," a Universal executive told him during a particularly brutal meeting. The man's office overlooked the studio lot, all that manufactured magic visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Harrison stood there, taking the rejection like a physical blow, and made a choice. He'd keep going. Not because he was confident he'd succeed, but because he literally didn't know what else to do. Acting had gotten under his skin like a splinter, and he couldn't dig it out no matter how hard he tried. Universal dropped his contract in 1968. He was 26 years old, had been in Hollywood for 4 years, and had nothing to show for it but a handful of credits that nobody remembered and a growing reputation as a reliable carpenter. His marriage to Mary was straining under the weight of uncertainty and poverty. They had a son now, Benjamin, born in 1967, which made everything more urgent and more terrifying. Harrison built sets for other people's dreams while his own seemed to slip further away with each passing day. But something was changing in Hollywood, even if Harrison couldn't see it yet. The old guard was dying, and a new generation of filmmakers was rising. People who didn't care about classical training or conventional good looks, who wanted authenticity and grit instead of polish and perfection. Harrison Ford, with his carpenter's hands and his stubborn refusal to quit, was exactly the kind of actor they were looking for. He just didn't know it yet. Part 2: The Wilderness Years. The mansion in Coldwater Canyon belonged to Sergio Mendes, the Brazilian musician whose bossa nova fusion had made him wealthy beyond the dreams of most working musicians. In the spring of 1970, Harrison Ford stood in the expansive living room, measuring the space where Mendes wanted a recording studio built. The house smelled of expensive wood and success, two things Harrison was intimately familiar with in others but had yet to claim for himself. He was 27 years old, and his career as an actor, if it could even be called that, was essentially dead. The past 2 years had brought exactly 3 minor television appearances, a forgettable turn on The FBI, another on Love, American Style, and a blink and you miss it roll on Dan August. The roles were so small, so inconsequential, that even his mother had trouble pretending they mattered when he called home. "Maybe you should think about teaching," his father had suggested during their last conversation. "You could teach drama at a high school somewhere. It's stable work." Harrison had hung up the phone and picked up his tools instead. The carpentry business was actually thriving. Word traveled fast in Hollywood about craftsmen who showed up on time, did excellent work, and didn't gossip about the famous people whose homes they entered. Harrison possessed all these qualities, plus an almost aggressive indifference to celebrity that the stars found refreshing. He didn't ask for autographs or photos. He didn't pitch them scripts or beg for introductions to their agents. He showed up, did the job, got paid, and left. At Mendez's house, he was building custom cabinets when a young woman walked through carrying a guitar case. She was slight, dark-haired, with an otherworldly quality that seemed at odds with the California sunshine streaming through the windows. Sally Kellerman, the actress, was visiting Mendez to discuss a musical project. "You're an actor," she said suddenly, stopping to watch Harrison work. It wasn't a question. Harrison looked up from the wood he was planing, sawdust clinging to his worn flannel shirt. "I'm a carpenter." "You're both," she insisted. She'd seen him in something. She couldn't remember what, which was itself telling, but she recognized the quality. "You should meet my friend Fred. Fred Roos. He's a casting director, works with Francis Ford Coppola." Harrison nodded noncommittally and went back to his work. He'd heard variations of this conversation before. Everyone in Los Angeles knew someone who knew someone. It rarely led anywhere except disappointment. But Sally Kellerman was persistent, and Fred Roos was looking for fresh faces for a project called The Godfather. When Roos called, Harrison went to the audition more out of politeness than hope. He read for the part of one of the Corleone brothers, bringing to it the same working-class authenticity he brought to everything. Coppola watched, made notes, thanked him for coming. Harrison didn't get the part. James Caan got Sonny, Al Pacino got Michael. Harrison went back to his hammer and saw, adding The Godfather to his mental list of near misses and almosts. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Fred Roos had filed his name away, impressed by something he saw beyond the unsuccessful audition. In Hollywood, connections weren't always immediate. Sometimes they germinated slowly, like seeds waiting for the right season. Mary was pregnant again. Their second son, Willard, would arrive in 1969, adding another mouth to feed and another reason for Harrison to take the carpentry work seriously. The acting dream was becoming exactly that, a dream, something indulged in during off hours, a hobby that refused to die even as it refused to live. He built a deck for composer Richard Zanuck, renovated a bathroom for Brazilian director Carlos Diegues, installed custom shelving for Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunn, the literary power couple who were also trying to make it in Hollywood's ruthless ecosystem. The work was good, honest, and it paid the bills. But every night, after his sons were asleep, Harrison would read scripts, practice monologues, study the performances of actors he admired, Spencer Tracy's naturalism, James Dean's intensity, Steve McQueen's cool restraint. The break, or what appeared to be a break, came in 1973 when he was cast in George Lucas's second feature film, American Graffiti. Lucas was a young director, only 30 years old, who'd made a cerebral science fiction film called T-Checks 1138 that had confused audiences and lost money. For his follow-up, he wanted to make something personal, a film about cruising culture in early 1960s California, a love letter to his teenage years in Modesto. Fred Roos, now working as a casting director on the film, remembered the intense Carpenter who'd auditioned for The Godfather. He brought Harrison in to read for the role of Bob Falfa, a drag racer who shows up in the film's third act to challenge the local hot rodding champion. Harrison read the script and saw immediately what Lucas was trying to do: capture a moment in American life just before everything changed, before Kennedy's assassination, before Vietnam exploded, before the innocents curdled into cynicism. The role of Bob Falfa wasn't large, maybe 10 minutes of screen time, but it was memorable. A swaggering cowboy in a '55 Chevy, all cocksure bravado masking deeper insecurity. The shoot took place in Petaluma and San Rafael, north of San Francisco, during the summer of 1972. Harrison watched Lucas work, the young director's meticulous attention to detail, his visual precision, his struggle to coax performances from a cast of mostly unknowns that included Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, and a remarkably talented young woman named Cindy Williams. Harrison's scenes came late in the production. He showed up in character, literally, arriving in the white Chevy that would become iconic in the film, and inhabited Bob Falfa completely. The swagger, the arrogance, the carefully maintained cool that cracks when things don't go his way. It was all there, distilled and perfect. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Lucas asked after a particularly good take. "Do what?" Harrison replied, genuinely confused. "Act like that. So natural." Harrison shrugged. "I'm just doing what's in the script." But it wasn't just the script. It was years of rejection, years of being told he'd never make it, years of watching other actors get the parts he wanted. All of that frustration and determination had forged something hard and real in him, an authenticity that the camera loved because it wasn't performed, it just was. American Graffiti premiered in August 1973 and became a phenomenon. Made for less than $800,000, it would gross over $200 million worldwide, making it one of the most profitable films in history. Critics praised its authenticity, its warmth, its perfect capture of a lost America. The cast became overnight sensations: Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, Cindy Williams, Paul Le Mat. Harrison Ford, despite a memorable performance, remained largely overlooked. His name appeared in the credits, and a few reviewers mentioned his effective turn as Bob Falfa, but he wasn't invited to the talk shows, wasn't featured in the magazine profiles. He was 31 years old and had just appeared in one of the biggest films of the year, and nothing changed. He went back to carpentry. The work helped him make sense of the senselessness. When you build a bookshelf, it either stands or it falls. There's no ambiguity, no subjectivity, no casting director's nephew who needs a job. The wood doesn't lie, and neither does the level. Harrison found a kind of zen in this, a peace that acting had never provided. But George Lucas hadn't forgotten him. The young director was planning something ambitious, a space opera, a Flash Gordon-style adventure serial blown up to epic proportions. He'd written a script called The Star Wars, and nobody in Hollywood wanted to make it except for Alan Ladd Jr. at 20th Century Fox, who'd seen something in Lucas's vision that others had missed. Lucas needed a cast. He wanted unknowns, or at least not quite knowns, people who could inhabit these characters without the baggage of previous roles. Fred Roos, once again serving as casting director, called Harrison. "George has this science fiction thing," Bruce explained over the phone. "It's weird, but it might be something. Can you come in and read with some of the actors we're auditioning?" Harrison's initial role was simply to feed lines to the young actors trying out for the lead roles. He wasn't being considered for a part. He was too old, too gruff, not right for what Lucas had in mind. But he needed the money, and reading lines for a few days paid better than not working at all. The auditions took place in early 1976, in a small office building in Los Angeles. Harrison showed up in his work clothes, literally coming from a carpentry job, and began reading opposite young actors auditioning for the role of Luke Skywalker: William Catt, Robbie Benson, Christopher Walken, and eventually Mark Hamill, a sweet-faced kid who seemed to embody the earnest heroism Lucas was looking for. For the role of Princess Leia, the audition list included Amy Irving, Jodie Foster, and a young woman named Carrie Fisher, daughter of Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher, who brought a sharp wit and a refusal to play the damsel in distress that intrigued Lucas. Harrison read the part of Han Solo, the smuggler, the mercenary, the rogue who cared about nothing except money and his ship. The character was terribly written in the early drafts, all exposition and clunky dialogue, space-age jargon that sounded ridiculous when spoken aloud. "You can type this stuff, George," Harrison told Lucas bluntly after one particularly awkward exchange. "But you can't say it." A different director might have been offended. Lucas, to his credit, listened. He watched Harrison deliver the lines with a sardonic edge, adding little bits of business, a smirk here, a dismissive gesture there, that made the character breathe. The young actors auditioning for Luke and Leia responded to Harrison's performance, raised their own game to match his energy. Lucas began to reconsider. Maybe Han Solo didn't need to be played by a conventional leading man. Maybe what the character needed was exactly this: a 33-year-old carpenter who'd been beaten down by Hollywood enough times to carry genuine cynicism, who could deliver terrible dialogue with enough charm to make it work, who had working man's hands and a face that suggested he'd lived through things. The decision wasn't immediate. Lucas tested other actors: Nick Nolte, Christopher Walken again, even Kurt Russell. But he kept coming back to the chemistry he'd seen when Harrison read with Mark and Carrie. There was something there, something that couldn't be manufactured. In March 1976, Harrison Ford got the call. He'd been cast as Han Solo in Star Wars. The pay was decent, $10,000 for the film, but more importantly, it was a leading role. Not the lead, but one of the central trio that would carry the story. Harrison's reaction was characteristically understated. "Okay," he told his agent. "When do we start?" He told Mary the news over dinner, watching her face cycle through emotions: relief, hope, cautious optimism. They'd been through this before, the promise of something that might finally be it. But American Graffiti had come and gone, and Harrison was still building cabinets. "This one feels different," he told her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. What he couldn't have known, what none of them could have known, was that George Lucas was about to change cinema forever, and Harrison Ford was about to become one of the most iconic film stars in history. But first, he had to go to England and put on a vest and a holster, and pretend to fly a spaceship through a galaxy far, far away. The Carpenter was about to become a legend. He just had to survive the shoot first. Part 3: A Galaxy Far, Far Away. The studios at Elstree, just north of London, were freezing in March 1976 when Harrison Ford first walked onto the set of Star Wars. The massive sound stages had been constructed during World War II, built to withstand German bombing raids, and they retained the damp chill of bunkers. Harrison, dressed in Han Solo's costume for the first time, white shirt, black vest, striped pants that looked vaguely like something a riverboat gambler might wear, wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. The Millennium Falcon cockpit sat before him, a semicircular construction of plywood, fiberglass, and switches that didn't actually do anything. Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher were already in their costumes, Mark in desert-colored pajamas that were supposed to be futuristic farm boy clothing, Carrie in a white dress with her hair wound into two bizarre buns on either side of her head. "We look ridiculous," Carrie said, not for the first time. She was 19 years old, wickedly intelligent, and already suspicious that this entire project might be career suicide. Her mother, Debbie Reynolds, had tried to talk her out of it. "Science fiction?" Debbie had said. "Nobody takes that seriously." Mark, 24 and Ernest, was more optimistic. He'd grown up reading comics and watching serials, and he could see what Lucas was attempting, a mythic hero's journey set among the stars. But even Mark had to admit that standing in a fake cockpit, pretending to dodge imaginary laser blasts while Lucas yelled directions from behind a camera, felt absurd. Harrison, at 33, was the oldest of the three leads and the most skeptical. He'd read the script, all of them had, and while there was something charming about its pulp adventure spirit, the dialogue was atrocious. Characters explained things that should have been obvious, declared their emotions instead of showing them, and spoke in a stilted, formal style that suggested English wasn't their first language. "George," Harrison said during rehearsals, holding up the script, "nobody talks like this. I've got a bad feeling about this." "Who says that?" "Han Solo says it," Lucas replied quietly. The director was shy, soft-spoken, often struggling to articulate his vision to actors who needed more concrete direction than faster and more intense. "Can I just say it my way?" Harrison asked. "Make it sound natural." Lucas considered this. He was a visual director, more comfortable with cameras and editing than with actors, and he'd surrounded himself with a largely British crew who found the whole production slightly ridiculous. The head cinematographer, Gilbert Taylor, who'd shot Dr. Strangelove for Kubrick, openly mocked Lucas's inexperience. The costume designer complained about the limitations. Even the producer, Gary Kurtz, seemed worried that they were in over their heads. "Tried your way," Lucas finally said. "We'll see." So Harrison did. He took Han Solo, a character written as a fairly generic space pirate, and found the swagger, the irony, the barely concealed romanticism beneath the mercenary exterior. When the script called for Han to say something earnest, Harrison delivered it with a smirk that suggested the character didn't quite believe his own bullshit. When Han was supposed to be heroic, Harrison made sure there was always an element of self-interest visible, a sense that Solo was still calculating the angles even while saving the day. The production was chaos from the beginning. The robot costumes, C-3PO and R2-D2, were nightmares. Anthony Daniels, the actor inside C-3PO, could barely move in the golden suit, and he could see almost nothing through the mask. Kenny Baker, operating R2-D2 from inside, had it even worse, trapped in a cylindrical prison that rolled unpredictably and frequently tipped over. The creature effects, overseen by a young crew that Lucas had assembled, were wildly ambitious. The cantina scene, where Han Solo first appears, shooting the alien bounty hunter Greedo under the table, required dozens of masks and costumes, each one representing a different alien species. The crew worked around the clock building these creatures, and on the day of shooting, Lucas looked at the assembled aliens and realized that most of them looked like people in rubber masks, which is exactly what they were. Harrison sat at the cantina table across from Paul Blake, the actor playing Greedo, who wore a green rubber suit and a mask with huge insectoid eyes. The scene called for them to have a tense conversation before Han shoots Greedo, but the mask made Blake's dialogue completely unintelligible. "Can anyone understand what he's saying?" Harrison asked after the third take. "We'll dub it in post," Lucas said, which became his answer to approximately 70% of the production's problems. The shoot stretched from March through July 1976, 4 months of 12-hour days in the cold British studios, interrupted by a brief location shoot in Tunisia for the desert planet Tatooine sequences. Harrison wasn't in those scenes. Han Solo doesn't appear until later in the film, so he stayed in London, working on his performance, trying to find the character beneath the clunky dialogue. His relationship with Carrie Fisher was complicated from the start. She was brilliant, neurotic, funny in a self-deprecating way that Harrison found both charming and exhausting. They began an affair during the production, keeping it secret from the crew, from Mark, from everyone. Carrie was 19, Harrison was 33 and married with 2 sons. It was exactly the kind of mistake Harrison had spent his entire life avoiding, and yet he fell into it anyway, drawn by Carrie's intelligence and her refusal to take any of this seriously. "We're making a movie about space wizards and walking carpets," she told him one night in her hotel room. "If we don't laugh at it, we'll go insane." The walking carpet was Chewbacca, played by Peter Mayhew, a 7'3" hospital orderly who'd been cast primarily because he was tall enough. The Wookiee costume was a yak hair nightmare that made Mayhew sweat through multiple suit linings per day. Harrison and Peter developed a genuine friendship during the shoot, partly because Harrison treated the man in the ape suit like an actual scene partner rather than a prop. "When you roar at me," Harrison told Peter during rehearsals, "I need to believe you're actually angry. Give me something to react to." Peter, whose gentle nature was the opposite of Chewbacca's fierce loyalty, learned to make his performance physical. The gestures, the posture, the way he moved his head to suggest emotion beneath the mask. Harrison played off this, treating Chewie like a real character, and their chemistry became one of the film's unexpected strengths. The lightsaber duels, featuring Alec Guinness as Obi-Wan Kenobi and David Prowse as Darth Vader, were frustratingly slow. Guinness, one of Britain's finest actors, had taken the role for the money and made no secret of his belief that the entire project was beneath him. He showed up, delivered his lines with professional competence, and collected his paycheck, which, thanks to a brilliant negotiation, included a percentage of the profits. "What do you think this film will make?" Harrison asked him during a break. Guinness shrugged. "A few million, perhaps? Enough for me to retire on." Neither of them could have imagined the hundreds of millions it would eventually earn, or that Guinness's small percentage would make him one of the wealthiest actors in Britain. The special effects were being handled by a new company Lucas had formed called Industrial Light and Magic, operating out of a warehouse in Van Nuys, California. The crew there, young mavericks including John Dykstra, Dennis Murin, and Phil Tippett, were inventing techniques as they went along, building models, designing camera systems, creating optical effects that had never been attempted at this scale. But Harrison, working in London, saw none of this. He acted opposite green screens, reacted to tennis balls on sticks that would later become spaceships, and trusted that somehow, in post-production, Lucas would make it all come together. It required a leap of faith that Harrison, after years of disappointment, wasn't naturally inclined to make. "This is either going to be amazing or a complete disaster," Mark Hamill said one day, watching Lucas try to explain to a cameraman how he wanted a shot to look. "My money's on disaster," Harrison replied, only half joking. The physical demands of the role were significant. Harrison did most of his own stunts, running through explosions, swinging across chasms on cables, dodging laser blasts that would be added later. At 33, he was in excellent shape from years of carpentry work, but the shoot was exhausting. He'd wake up sore, spend 12 hours on set, then collapse in his hotel room, too tired even to call Mary back in Los Angeles. His marriage was crumbling, had been crumbling for years, really. The affair with Carrie was a symptom, not a cause. Mary knew something was wrong, wives always know, but Harrison was too much of a coward to address it directly. He told himself he'd deal with it after the shoot, after he got home, after he figured out whether this film would finally be the thing that changed his career. The final weeks of production were a mad rush to finish before the money ran out. Lucas was over budget and behind schedule, and the studio executives at 20th Century Fox were panicking. They'd seen rough cuts of some sequences and couldn't make sense of them. Where was the story? Why was everything so strange? Who were these characters, and why should anyone care about them? Alan Ladd Jr., the Fox executive who'd greenlit the project, remained supportive, but he was increasingly alone in his faith. When Lucas showed an early cut to his director friends, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, Martin Scorsese, the response was mixed at best. De Palma openly mocked it, calling it childish and incomprehensible. Spielberg saw the potential but worried the pacing was off. Scorsese remained diplomatically silent. Lucas, devastated by the response, returned to the editing room and kept cutting, kept rearranging, kept trying to find the film hidden inside the footage. His marriage to his editor, Marcia Lucas, was under strain from the pressure. He developed stomach problems from the stress. He was convinced he'd made a terrible mistake, that Star Wars would be the film that ended his career. Harrison, back in Los Angeles, returned to Carpentry. The film wouldn't be released until May 1977, nearly a year away, and in the meantime, he needed to work. He took jobs building furniture, renovating kitchens, anything to pay the bills while he waited to see if Han Solo would be his breakthrough or his final embarrassment. He separated from Mary, though they didn't divorce immediately. The boys, Ben and Willard, were young enough that they didn't fully understand what was happening. Harrison moved into a small apartment, filled it with his tools, and tried to figure out who he was beyond the roles he'd failed to land and the marriage he'd failed to maintain. Carrie sent him letters from Los Angeles, funny and sad and neurotic. Their affair had ended with the production, both of them recognizing it for what it was, a brief escape from reality. Two people seeking comfort in the absurdity of what they were doing. But they remained friends, bonded by the shared experience of making something that might be magnificent, or might be a career-ending disaster. In December 1976, Harrison got a call from his agent. Steven Spielberg was making a film about World War II, a comedy adventure set in 1941 Los Angeles, and he wanted to meet about a role. It wasn't the lead, but it was a good part, a military officer, serious and competent, which was different from Han Solo's roguish charm. Harrison read the script for 1941 and agreed to do it. The money was good, and Spielberg was someone everyone in Hollywood wanted to work with. The young director had just finished Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and was already being called a genius. But first, Spielberg wanted to talk about a different project. "I'm developing this adventure film," Spielberg said during their meeting. "Set in the 1930s, about an archaeologist who hunts for religious artifacts. George Lucas came up with the character, a professor who's also a man of action, like James Bond but with a whip instead of gadgets." Harrison listened, intrigued despite himself. "We're calling it Raiders of the Lost Ark," Spielberg continued. "And I want you to play the lead. Indiana Jones." Harrison thought about this. Another Lucas project, another leap of faith. But Spielberg was directing this time, and the concept sounded more grounded than space opera, more in line with the classic adventure films Harrison had grown up watching. "Let me read the script," Harrison said. "There is no script yet," Spielberg admitted. "But trust me, this is going to be something special." Harrison had heard that before. But he'd also learned, after years of rejection and near misses, that sometimes you had to take chances on things that didn't make sense, on projects that seemed doomed, on directors who promise you the moon. "Okay," he said. "I'm in." But first, Star Wars had to come out. And nobody, not Lucas, not Harrison, not anyone involved in the production, had any idea what was about to happen. The galaxy was about to change. And Harrison Ford, the carpenter who couldn't quit acting, was about to become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. He just didn't know it yet. Part 4. The Lightning Strike. May 25, 1977, started like any other Wednesday for Harrison Ford. He woke up in his modest apartment in the Hollywood Hills, made coffee in the small kitchen where he'd installed custom cabinets himself, and contemplated the carpentry job he was scheduled to finish that afternoon, built-in shelving for a producer in Brentwood who kept changing his mind about the design. Somewhere across Los Angeles, at Mann's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, lines were already forming. They'd started the night before, actually. a handful of science fiction enthusiasts camping out to be among the first to see George Lucas's space opera. By dawn, the line stretched around the block. By noon, it extended for 3 blocks. Theater management had never seen anything like it. Harrison knew the film was opening that day. He'd been to the premiere a week earlier, sitting in the dark watching himself on screen, still uncertain about what he was seeing. The audience had responded well, applauding at the right moments, gasping when Alderaan exploded, cheering when the Millennium Falcon outran the TIE fighters. But premiere audiences were always enthusiastic. The real test was whether regular people, spending their own money, would buy tickets to see a weird science fiction film with no stars. The reviews had been mixed. Some critics understood what Lucas was attempting. Pauline Kael would later call it a box of Cracker Jack that's all prizes, while Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars, recognizing its pure entertainment value. But others dismissed it as childish, derivative, a glossy but empty spectacle. Vincent Candy at the New York Times wrote that it was the movie that's fun without being very interesting. Harrison didn't read the reviews. He'd learned, over years of rejection, that critics rarely determined success or failure. What mattered was whether people showed up, whether they told their friends, whether the film found its audience. By mid-afternoon on that first Wednesday, something extraordinary was happening. The lines at theaters across America weren't dispersing, they were growing. Showings were selling out, and people who'd just seen the film were getting back in line to see it again. Theater owners called 20th Century Fox in a panic, demanding more prints. The studio, which had been cautiously optimistic about the film's prospects, suddenly realized they were sitting on something unprecedented. Harrison's phone rang around 6 that evening. It was his agent, sounding breathless. "Have you seen the numbers?" "What numbers?" Harrison was standing in his work clothes, covered in sawdust, holding a beer. "The box office numbers. Star Wars is going to do $5 million this weekend. Maybe more." Harrison processed this. $5 million in 3 days was excellent for any film. For a science fiction movie with unknown leads, it was extraordinary. "That's good," he said, characteristically understated. "Good? Harrison, this is going to be the biggest film of the year. Maybe the biggest film ever. You're going to be a star." Harrison hung up and finished his beer. He'd heard promises before. He'd learned not to trust them. But this time, the promises were true. By the end of the weekend, Star Wars had grossed $6.4 million, a record-breaking opening that shocked everyone, including Lucas, who'd fled to Hawaii with Steven Spielberg to avoid the stress of the premiere. When Lucas called the studio from Maui to check on the numbers, they told him he just made the most successful film in 20th Century Fox history. The cultural phenomenon happened fast, faster than anyone could have predicted. Within 2 weeks, Star Wars imagery was everywhere. Kids on playgrounds pretending to be Luke and Han, toy stores frantically trying to meet demand for action figures that didn't exist yet, midnight showings selling out months in advance. People weren't just seeing the film once. They were seeing it 5, 10, 20 times, memorizing dialogue, debating plot points, creating fan art. Harrison Ford, who'd spent 13 years trying to make it as an actor, who'd been dropped by 2 studios and told he'd never succeed, was suddenly recognizable everywhere he went. He'd walk into a grocery store and hear kids whispering, "That's Han Solo." Women approached him in restaurants, asking for autographs. Photographers waited outside his apartment building. The attention was disorienting. For years, Harrison had existed in a kind of professional invisibility. The guy who delivered the lines in auditions, the reliable carpenter who showed up on time. Now, suddenly, strangers wanted to touch him, to have pieces of him, to claim some small connection to the character he'd played. Carrie Fisher, at 19, handled the fame with dark humor and self-medication. She gave brilliant, neurotic interviews where she mocked the film even while acknowledging its success. Mark Hamill embraced his role as Luke Skywalker, doing press tours and conventions, signing autographs with genuine warmth. Harrison retreated. He did the minimum required press, showed up for the obligatory interviews, but made it clear he wasn't interested in being a celebrity. When interviewers asked him to talk about Han Solo's inner life or the philosophical implications of the Force, he'd shrug and say, "It's a movie about spaceships. Don't overthink it." This gruffness, this refusal to play the Hollywood game, only made him more fascinating to the public. Harrison Ford wasn't selling a persona. He was simply being himself, a workman who happened to be in a successful film. The contrast between Han Solo's swagger and Harrison's reluctant interviews created an appealing mystique. By July 1977, Star Wars had grossed over $100 million domestically, a figure that seemed impossible. The film played in some theaters continuously for over a year. Lines never diminished. The cultural impact deepened. John Williams's score was everywhere. Kids wore C-3PO pajamas to bed and woke up to R2-D2 alarm clocks. The film had tapped into something primal in the American consciousness, a need for heroes, for clear moral lines, for the certainty that good could triumph over evil if you were brave enough. For Harrison, the success was both liberating and terrifying. The carpentry jobs dried up immediately, not because he didn't want to work, but because producers and directors suddenly wanted him for film roles. Scripts arrived at his agent's office daily, most of them terrible, trying to capitalize on Han Solo's success by offering Harrison similar roguish characters in inferior space operas. He turned down almost everything. The one project he'd committed to before Star Wars exploded was Spielberg's 1941, which began shooting in October 1977. The production was chaos. Spielberg, emboldened by the success of Jaws and Close Encounters, had convinced Universal to give him a massive budget for a comedy about panic in Los Angeles after Pearl Harbor. Harrison played Major General Joseph Stilwell with a deadpan seriousness that was meant to be funny against the manic energy around him. But the production spiraled out of control. Spielberg's perfectionism combined with an enormous cast and complicated special effects resulted in a bloated, unfocused film that would ultimately disappoint both critics and audiences when it was released in 1979. Working on 1941 reminded Harrison why he'd been skeptical of Hollywood success. Money and hype didn't guarantee quality. The best intentions could produce mediocre results. The same system that had rejected him for years was now throwing opportunities at him, and most of them were garbage. But there was one project that interested him. Raiders of the Lost Ark, the adventure film Spielberg and Lucas had discussed. The script, written by Lawrence Kasdan, had finally arrived, and Harrison read it in one sitting, immediately recognizing its potential. Indiana Jones was different from Han Solo, more educated, more idealistic despite his cynicism, a man who believed in the historical and spiritual significance of the artifacts he pursued. But there were similarities too, the roguish charm, the quick wit, the willingness to punch first and ask questions later. Lucas, still controlling about his creations, initially hesitated about casting Harrison. He worried about audiences seeing Han Solo in a fedora instead of accepting a new character. He tested other actors. Tom Selleck was the frontrunner until his television commitments made him unavailable. Nick Nolte was considered. Jeff Bridges read for the part. But Spielberg fought for Harrison. He'd seen something during their work on 1941. A naturalism, a ability to make even absurd situations feel grounded. Indiana Jones needed that quality, needed someone who could chase a giant boulder while making you believe he was terrified, who could face supernatural horror while maintaining his skepticism. Lucas finally relented, and Harrison was cast as Indiana Jones in late 1979. The shoot would begin in the summer of 1980, filming in locations across the globe: France, Tunisia, Hawaii. It would be grueling, physical, demanding. Harrison was approaching 40 years old, and the role required him to run, fight, and perform stunts that would exhaust men half his age. In the meantime, Lucas was already working on the sequel to Star Wars, now officially titled The Empire Strikes Back. Harrison had signed a contract for 3 films, so he was obligated to return as Han Solo, though he had concerns about the character's arc. He needs to change, Harrison told Lucas during a story meeting. He can't just be the same cynical smuggler. The events of the first film should have affected him. Lucas, working with director Irvin Kershner and screenwriter Lee Brackett, agreed. The new script put Han in a romantic relationship with Princess Leia, gave him real stakes in the rebellion, and ended with him frozen in carbonite, a fate Harrison had actually requested. "Kill me off," Harrison had suggested. "It'll give the story more weight." Lucas refused to kill Han Solo, but the carbonite compromise satisfied Harrison's desire to give the character a meaningful dramatic moment. Filming took place in Norway and at Elstree Studios in London from March through September 1979, and it was a markedly different experience from the first film. The budget was larger, the expectations higher, and the pressure enormous. Lucas, serving as executive producer while Kershner directed, was simultaneously building his empire, expanding industrial light and magic, establishing Skywalker Ranch, positioning himself as an independent filmmaker who could operate outside the traditional studio system. Harrison watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Lucas was proving that success could buy freedom, that a filmmaker could control his own destiny if he had enough money and vision. But Harrison also saw the cost. Lucas's marriage to Marcia was crumbling under the pressure, just as Harrison's marriage to Mary had collapsed under the weight of his struggles. Harrison's own personal life was complicated. His divorce from Mary was finalized in 1979, and he began a relationship with screenwriter Melissa Matheson, whom he'd met during the filming of Apocalypse Now, in the Philippines, where Melissa was working as Francis Ford Coppola's assistant and Harrison had visited the set. Melissa was intelligent, creative, emotionally available in ways that Harrison struggled to be. She understood the demands of filmmaking but maintained her own career, working on scripts including what would become The Black Stallion. Their relationship felt different from his marriage to Mary, less about obligation and more about genuine partnership. The Empire Strikes Back premiered in May 1980 to mixed initial reactions. Some critics found it darker and less fun than the original, though it would eventually be recognized as the best film in the trilogy. Harrison's performance was deeper, more nuanced. Han Solo had grown from a selfish smuggler into a man willing to sacrifice for something larger than himself, and Harrison embodied that transformation completely. The famous exchange, "I love you," / "I know," became iconic, and it was Harrison's improvisation. The script had Han responding, "I love you too," but Harrison felt it was too sentimental, too expected. His alternative was perfect, cocky, vulnerable, completely in character. Just weeks after Empire opened, Harrison was on a plane to Tunisia to begin shooting Raiders of the Lost Arkansas. The production was punishing, 122-degree heat, food poisoning that swept through the crew, physical stunts that left Harrison bruised and exhausted. The famous scene where Indy shoots the sword-wielding assassin was supposed to be an elaborate fight sequence, but Harrison was too sick to perform it, so he suggested simply shooting the guy. Spielberg loved it, and the improvisation became one of the film's most memorable moments. Harrison turned 38 during the shoot, performing his own stunts, being dragged behind a truck, fighting on top of moving vehicles, running through ancient temples rigged with explosives. A herniated disc in his back caused agonizing pain, but he pushed through, driven by a work ethic forged during his years as a carpenter. You finished the job, no matter what. Raiders of the Lost Ark opened in June 1981 and became another massive hit, grossing over $380 million worldwide. Harrison Ford was now the star of the two biggest franchises in cinema history. The carpenter who couldn't get arrested in Hollywood was suddenly the most bankable star on the planet. But success hadn't changed his fundamental nature. He still avoided the Hollywood party scene, still gave interviews where he seemed vaguely irritated to be there, still insisted on doing his own stunts, and treating acting like a job rather than an art form. "I'm not interested in being a movie star," he told one interviewer. "I'm interested in doing good work." The distinction mattered to him, even if nobody else understood it. Harrison Ford had spent too many years on the outside to fully trust his position on the inside. He'd been rejected too many times to believe that success was permanent, or that Hollywood's adulation meant anything real. But the work, the actual work of inhabiting characters, of finding truth in fantasy, of making audiences believe in impossible things, that mattered. That was real. And for the first time in his life, Harrison Ford was being paid to do it at the highest level, in the biggest films in the world. The carpenter had finally built something that would last. Part 5. The Weight of Icons. The photograph taken at Skywalker Ranch in Northern California in January 1982 captured something almost impossible to articulate. Harrison Ford, sitting in a canvas director's chair with Han Solo, stenciled on the back, staring at the script for Return of the Jedi, with an expression that mixed resignation and determination. He was 39 years old, and he was about to put on the vest and holster for the third and, he hoped, final time. The relationship between Harrison and the character that had made him famous had always been complicated. Han Solo had given him everything he'd spent 13 years chasing: recognition, financial security, the ability to choose his roles. But Harrison also felt trapped by the character, concerned that audiences would never see him as anything other than the wisecracking space smuggler. George Lucas, now one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood, had structured the new film to give each of the main characters their moment. Mark Hamill's Luke would confront Vader and the Emperor, completing his journey from farm boy to Jedi Knight. Carrie Fisher's Leia would be revealed as Luke's sister and lead the rebellion's ground assault. Han Solo would, well, that was the problem. What does Han actually do in this script? Harrison asked during the first read-through at Lucas's compound. The answer, frustratingly, was that Han was largely reactive. He got rescued from Carbonite, spent much of the film trying to prove his worth to Leia, and helped destroy the Death Star's shield generator. There was no real character arc, no transformation, no meaningful growth. He was essentially the same person at the end of the film as at the beginning. Harrison had lobbied hard for Han to die heroically in this film, sacrificing himself to save the rebellion. It would give the character weight, stakes, meaning. Lucas refused, concerned that killing a beloved character would alienate audiences and damage the merchandising potential that was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. "This is about selling toys," Harrison said bluntly during one particularly tense meeting. Lucas didn't deny it. The Star Wars franchise had revolutionized film merchandising, creating a business model that would dominate Hollywood for decades. Action figures, lunchboxes, bedsheets. The licensing revenue dwarfed even the film's massive box office returns. Han Solo Alive sold more products than Han Solo Dead. So Harrison put on the costume one more time and reported to the Arizona desert where the Tatooine sequences would be filmed, then to the redwood forests of Northern California for the Ender scenes, and finally back to Elstree Studios in London for the soundstage work. The shoot ran from January through May 1982, and it was the least enjoyable of the three films for Harrison. Director Richard Marquand, a competent craftsman but lacking Irving Kershner's visual flair or George Lucas's original vision, struggled to control the production. Lucas, though officially just the executive producer and writer, hovered over everything, micromanaging shots and second-guessing creative decisions. The atmosphere on set was tense, professional but joyless. The Ewoks, the teddy bear-like creatures that inhabited Ender, represented everything Harrison disliked about the direction the franchise had taken. They were cute, marketable, and narratively unnecessary, existing primarily to sell plush toys to children. During filming of the scenes where Han interacted with the Ewoks, Harrison's barely concealed contempt occasionally showed through in his performance. "I'm a 40-year-old man talking to a puppet," he muttered to Carrie between takes. "We're all talking to puppets, darling," she replied, gesturing at the Ewok performers in their fuzzy suits. "Welcome to the legacy we're creating." Carrie understood better than any of them what Star Wars had become, a cultural institution that existed beyond their control or input. She'd watched her character be marketed, sexualized, transformed into lunch boxes and Halloween costumes. The gold bikini costume she wore in Jabba's palace would become one of the most iconic and most objectifying images in cinema history, something Carrie would spend decades commenting on with her characteristic dark wit. Mark Hamill, ever the enthusiast, maintained his love for the material even as the production dragged on. He still believed in Luke's journey, still found meaning in the mythology Lucas had created. But even Mark admitted that this film felt different, more calculated, less spontaneous, more aware of its own importance. Harrison counted the days until his contract was fulfilled. He had other projects lined up, other characters to explore. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner had been released in June 1982, just as Jedi was wrapping, and though the film had underperformed at the box office and received mixed reviews, Harrison was proud of the work. Rick Deckard was everything Han Solo wasn't: introspective, damaged, uncertain. The film's more aesthetic and philosophical questioning represented the kind of adult science fiction Harrison wanted to be associated with. The contrast between Blade Runner and Return of the Jedi couldn't have been more stark. One was a dark meditation on humanity and mortality, the other a merchandising juggernaut designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. Harrison knew which one better represented his artistic ambitions, even if the public preferred his work in the more commercial franchise. Return of the Jedi premiered in May 1983 and became another massive hit, earning over $475 million worldwide despite the mixed critical reception. Reviewers praised the action sequences and special effects but criticized the Ewoks and the repetitive nature of another Death Star plot. Audiences didn't care. They lined up to see the conclusion of the trilogy, to witness Luke's confrontation with Vader, to get their final dose of Han, Luke, and Leia's adventures. For Harrison Ford, the premiere represented liberation. His contract was complete. He'd never have to put on Han Solo's costume again unless he chose to, and he had no intention of choosing to. At 40 years old, he was determined to prove he was more than a space smuggler and a whip-wielding archaeologist. His marriage to Melissa Matheson in March 1983 represented a new chapter. They'd been together for 4 years, and Melissa had written the screenplay for E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which had become the highest-grossing film of all time when it was released in 1982. They were Hollywood royalty, but neither of them particularly cared about that status. They bought a ranch in Wyoming, far from Los Angeles, where Harrison could indulge his love of flying. He'd gotten his pilot's license in 1966, but only recently had the money to pursue it seriously. The ranch became his refuge. He'd fly his helicopter over the mountains, land in remote areas, and spend days away from phones, press, and the crushing weight of fame. Melissa understood his need for solitude in a way Mary never had. She had her own career, her own creative life, and didn't need Harrison to be anything other than who he was. Their son Malcolm was born in 1987, followed by daughter Georgia in 1990. Harrison, now in his 40s and approaching 50, was determined to be more present for these children than he'd been for Ben and Willard. His relationship with his older sons, now teenagers and young adults, was cordial but distant, a casualty of his years struggling to make it, of the divorce, of his own emotional unavailability. Professionally, Harrison spent the mid-1980s trying to diversify. He starred in Peter Weir's Witness in 1985, playing a Philadelphia detective who goes undercover in an Amish community. The role earned him his only Academy Award nomination for Best Actor and proved he could carry a serious drama. He followed it with The Mosquito Coast in 1986, a dark exploration of American idealism gone mad, directed by Weir and based on Paul Theroux's novel. The Mosquito Coast was a commercial disappointment but artistically ambitious, showcasing Harrison's range. His character, Allie Fox, was abrasive, difficult, ultimately destructive, the opposite of Han Solo's roguish charm. Critics praised the performance but audiences stayed away, uncomfortable seeing Harrison Ford play someone so fundamentally unlikable. The box office failure stung. Harrison had taken a risk, chosen a challenging role over a commercial sure thing, and the market had rejected it. The lesson seemed clear. Audiences wanted him as a hero, an action star, someone who punched bad guys and got the girl. Anything more complex, more demanding, was a harder sell. So when Steven Spielberg came calling again with another Indiana Jones adventure, Harrison said yes. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade began filming in 1988. With Sean Connery cast as Indy's father in a stroke of perfect casting that added emotional depth to the franchise. The relationship between father and son, complicated, competitive, ultimately loving, gave Harrison something real to play, even within the fantasy-adventure framework. The shoot reunited Harrison with Spielberg's infectious enthusiasm and technical mastery. Unlike the grueling production of Raiders or The Troubled Temple of Doom, which Harrison had filmed in 1983 between Jedi and Witness, Last Crusade was actually fun. The chemistry with Connery was genuine, and their scenes together crackled with wit and warmth. Last Crusade premiered in May 1989 and earned over $474 million worldwide, re-establishing Indiana Jones as one of cinema's most beloved characters. Harrison was 46 years old, and somehow he was still playing action heroes, still running from explosions, still making it look effortless even as his knees ached and his back protested. The 1990s brought new challenges. The action genre was changing. Younger stars like Bruce Willis, Mel Gibson, and Arnold Schwarzenegger were dominating the box office with a more ironic, self-aware approach to heroism. Harrison's earnest, grounded performances felt increasingly old-fashioned in comparison. He starred in a series of thrillers and dramas throughout the decade. Presumed Innocent, Patriot Games, The Fugitive, Clear and Present Danger, that were commercially successful but rarely memorable. The Fugitive, in 1993, was the exception, a perfectly crafted thriller that showcased Harrison's ability to convey desperation and determination without excessive dialogue. But something was shifting. The roles were becoming repetitive. Variations on the same theme of the ordinary man thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Harrison was wealthy beyond imagination, respected within the industry, and utterly bored with the parts he was being offered. His marriage to Melissa began to deteriorate in the late 1990s. The ranch in Wyoming, once a refuge, became a place they each retreated to separately, avoiding rather than connecting. The pressures of two successful careers, of raising children in the shadow of fame, of maintaining privacy in an increasingly intrusive media landscape, it all took its toll. They separated in 2001 and divorced in 2004, a quiet ending to a 21-year partnership. Harrison, now in his 60s, faced a crisis of relevance. The film industry had changed dramatically since he'd first arrived in Los Angeles in the 1960s. The kind of mid-budget dramas and thrillers he built his career on were disappearing, replaced by comic book blockbusters and franchises. In 2015, at 73 years old, Harrison did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He put on Han Solo's vest one more time for The Force Awakens, the first new Star Wars film in a decade. George Lucas had sold Lucasfilm to Disney for $4 billion, and the new corporate owners wanted to revive the franchise with the original cast. Harrison negotiated one condition: Han Solo had to die. Not frozen in carbonite, not captured or retired, actually, meaningfully dead. After 38 years, he wanted closure for the character, wanted to give Han's story the ending it had been denied in Return of the Jedi. The scene where Han confronts his son, Kylo Ren, on the bridge inside Starkiller Base became one of the most talked about moments in the film. Harrison played it with a vulnerability he never brought to Han before. A father trying to save his son, knowing he's probably going to fail, doing it anyway because love demands the attempt. When Kylo's lightsaber pierced Han's chest, when Harrison's face registered shock and sorrow and a kind of acceptance, the character who'd defined his career finally received the death Harrison had wanted for him decades earlier. Harrison Ford was 73 years old, and Han Solo was finally, irrevocably gone. But the carpenter from Park Ridge, Illinois, who'd spent 13 years being told he'd never make it, who'd build bookshelves for movie stars while dreaming of being one himself, who'd stumbled into the role of a lifetime almost by accident, that man was still standing. He'd lived long enough to see himself become a legend, to watch characters he'd created become part of the cultural DNA of multiple generations. Children who hadn't been born when Star Wars premiered knew Han Solo. Film students analyzed his performances in Blade Runner and The Fugitive. He'd been nominated for an Academy Award, received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Film Institute, and been recognized as one of the most successful actors in cinema history. The journey from Ripon College to Starkiller Base had taken 50 years, crossed continents and galaxies, transformed a philosophy major into an icon. Harrison Ford had lived multiple lifetimes within his one extraordinary life: the struggling actor, the reluctant star, the action hero, the serious dramatic performer, the legend refusing to retire. The tools from his carpentry days still sat in his garage in Wyoming, well maintained but rarely used. He'd built his last bookshelf decades ago, but the craftsman's ethic remained: show up, do the work, don't complain, make it as good as you possibly can. That was the real story of Harrison Ford, not the characters he'd played, or the money he'd earned, or the fame he never wanted, but the stubborn refusal to quit, even when quitting would have been easier, more sensible, more rational. He'd been told he'd never make it, and he'd proved them wrong by simply refusing to believe them. That was enough. That would always be enough.